Feel really at home. The big warm welcome to our first presenter, Charile Tweed.
Well, good evening, everyone. How are we going? Is the speaker all right or not so good? I can hold one if you're all right. Yeah, okay, I can do that. How's that sound? Much better. Yeah, cool. How good to be back. Number 6, Quentin. Yeah, so thanks, Dylan, Quentin, Dylan's mum. It's been a great experience. It's easily the best conference I've ever been to, hence why we all keep coming back. For the people that have not been here before, I'll see you next year. It's awesome. So tonight I'm going to depart from my usual clinical-based presentation and talk about something a little bit different, which is risk. And we're going to talk about the good, the bad and the ugly, but actually it's going to be the bad, the good and then the ugly. I'm an emergency physician. I'm very much at the tail end of my career. I am going to retire at the end of the year. I'm delighted. And I only currently work 1 month on and then 3 months off. And the 3 months that I have off, I go and live in my van and go climbing. That's my risk. Occasionally I take the dog with me if I'm happy. I'd love to be a ski bum, but I think I've left that run a bit too late. So that's me. Okay. What is risk? Well, it depends who you ask, and context is basically everything. But the most commonly accepted definition is the uncertainty that something may result in a loss or an injury. That kind of makes sense to me, that rings true. We are an increasingly risk-averse society. And that's perceived as a good thing. Risk is bad. If you go back a couple of generations, the definition of risk was quite different. There was more of a positive slant on it. It was more an opportunity rather than a threat. And I think that's central to my theme my theme tonight on my talk of risk. So the context. I'm going to talk about 4 domains tonight. One of them, well, all of them, I think, will affect most of you in the room. The first thing is money. It's a bit of an odd concept for a medical conference, I accept, but we all have super, we all pay into super, we all take risks or don't take risks with our money, and there are implications associated with that. The next thing I'm going to talk about are our children. So apologies to non-breeders, but most of us will have children or already have children, and that's also one of the most important things in our lives. The third domain I'm going to talk about are our passions, our activities, the things that we choose to do that make us who we are or define us in some ways. And for me, obviously, that's rock climbing. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to talk a lot about rock climbing tonight. And the fourth thing is, well, it's a medical conference. We've got to put a bit of medicine in there. And so I'm going to talk about risk in medicine. For all the dads out there, and I'm one, and I'm of an age, there's another kind of risk. You all know it. I'm not going to be talking about the ball game. So let's very briefly talk about money. So what is risk in money, in finance? Well, it's defined as volatility, the chance that something can go up in price or down in price. And that's what risk is when you look at money. And the returns, the amount that you can get out of your investment, are proportionate to the level of risk that you take. So the riskier assets go up more, defensive assets don't go up more, but they're safer. And in broad terms in finance, cash is the safest, bonds are next safest, real estate is next safest, and the most risky thing are stocks and shares, equities. I'm old, Most of you probably remember the GFC. That's what happened. If you were in equities at that point, you lost 45% of your money. Risk is bad. I'm going to talk about children now, but mostly children at play. What kills kids? Globally, of course, it's infectious diseases. In our lives, in the Western world, due to rising living standards and vaccinations, I'm not political, but it's pretty easy to pick holes in RFK and Donald Trump's administration at the moment. Vaccinations have saved us from the mortality of infectious diseases. So for our kids, what are the chances of dying? Well, low, and primarily it's from trauma. That's motor vehicle crashes, and then it's activity related, primarily the sports that they do. And the same for morbidity. What are the injuries that they get? Again, motor vehicle crashes, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight. Then falls, sporting activities. Where do they get these injuries? It won't be a surprise for pre-hospital staff and emergency staff that they come from playgrounds. So the monkey bars, they're a prime culprit. The trampoline is another prime culprit. And then there's Christmas. And little Johnny gets a bicycle and a skateboard. And I think if you've ever done a shift on a Christmas or a Boxing Day, you will recognise that spike in presentations shortly after lunch. When little Johnny's fallen off his bike or his skateboard, and then that subsequent spike about 3 hours later when Dad, who's had too many beers at the barbecue, gets on the ripstick and comes in with his Colles fracture. So that's one group. The bigger group perhaps is organised sports, and for males, for teenage boys, that's the rugby codes in Australia and New Zealand, of course. So it makes up the predominant, the majority. For females or girls, it's netball, and that would be 32%, and that's predominantly knees, nothing you don't know. And usually these are not serious, but occasionally, as we know, that there are, events that occur, spinal injuries, tragic as they are. So how do we make kids safer? That's the bad bit. How do we try and improve upon it? Now, again, I'm 59 this year, terrible as it sounds. I remember slides like that. You won't find a slide like that. And to illustrate how things have changed for children in play, I'm going to talk about an event that occurred. And this event occurred in New York in the 1980s, and it was off a similar slide to that. A 6-year-old boy sadly fell from the top of one of these slides and landed on the concrete and died from a head injury. For some reason, and it wasn't an isolated event, but for some reason this captured the imagination of the press and of the population, and there was a period of soul searching. And there were two people that then did a review of what the state of play was in the United States. So it was an epidemiologist and a pediatric public health physician, and they identified that there were astoundingly several 100,000 injuries or deaths every year within the United States. That's a terrible number. And so on the basis of that, there was a Federal Consumer Safety Commission, an appropriate response, and various dignitaries and luminaries were invited to sit upon this and make recommendations, which they did. And they issued a series of guidelines about playgrounds to try and prevent this kind of death from occurring again. And they recommended numerous things that we'll recognise in all of our playgrounds today, that you get spongy shit on the floor and all the steps are about the same size, and there's railings so that no one can fall off, and there's a maximum height so that even if they do fall off they don't hurt themselves. Brilliant. Now the most boring part of the talk, which is to talk about medicine, and we're going to go back, and this is going to be a retrospective of my early life. That's me on the far right. That is 1991, qualifying with a glass of champagne and so woefully prepared for what was ahead of me. I qualified from St George's Hospital in medical school, and this was in an unusual part of London. So we were in Tooting, which is an impoverished suburb in the south of London. There were 4 population groups there, one which was medical students. The second was people from the Indian subcontinent, Bangladesh, India and Pakistan. A slightly smaller population of West Indian people, notably from Jamaica. And prior to that, the wave of immigrants was from Ireland, Southern Ireland. It was great as a medical student. The Irish always had lock-ins in the pub, so that when the closing time came along at 11 o'clock, you could stay there for as long as you liked. And after I qualified, I went to my first intern job at St Richard's Hospital in Chichester. That's the entire junior staff for a moderately sized district general hospital. 3 of my friends from med school are now consultants there. They have over 4 times the junior staff there nowadays, and the workload obviously has gone up, but not proportionately. And so let's talk about the risk when I first qualified as a doctor. The place that's obvious and should be the most clear, salient risk is the number of hours that we worked. So my first week on call as an intern, I did 112 hours. That didn't leave very many hours in the week to sleep. That came down slightly, probably averaged around 90. The pay was appalling, so it's £4.50 an hour. But that was only for the first 40 hours. Every hour of overtime that you did over 40 hours was paid at 1/4 of the rate. £1.15. We were the lowest paid people in the entire NHS. It doesn't take a genius, and there aren't many geniuses in medical administration, but it doesn't take a genius to work out that the less doctors you have, the less you have to pay them. What about our training? Well, I alluded to earlier that when I qualified from med school, I was woefully unprepared. That's an understatement. I wasn't a good student. I went on holiday a lot. I had a great time. Didn't turn up to many things. When I first got onto the ward, I realised that much of my job was going to be inserting cannulas. I had tried to insert a cannula once as an intern, as a trainee, as a medical student, and failed. The teaching on our job was poor. We had 1 hour a week of dedicated teaching time. Most people didn't turn up because there was too much to do. There was no ongoing education, really, as a junior doctor. What about the expectations? What were we meant to do? Well, we were meant to do everything, really. We were not expected to ask questions. We were not expected to admit weakness. We were not expected to ask for help. If you didn't ask for help, you were seen as a good junior doctor, and if you did, you were seen as a bad junior doctor. And so part of the training, going back one step, and this is the salient risk for me, was doing procedures. So the old adage of see one, do one, teach one pretty much applied, except when you just had to do one. I mean, the numbers were extraordinary. As an intern, I know for a fact I did 6 central lines. I did well in excess of 40 chest drains because I worked on a respiratory ward, reset fractures, and some idiot let me put in a transvenous pacing wire. it was hard. So how did we cope? Well, I think it's fair to say that no one practiced mindfulness. We smoked, 80% of us smoked. We were allowed to smoke in the doctor's mess. For context, patients were allowed to smoke in the day lounge with their fractures. We drank a lot. It would be accurate to say that I was either asleep at work or drunk as a junior doctor, and on occasions, all three at once. So yeah, we had a lot of time. We had a great time. And, you know, despite sounding terrible, it was great. I had a lovely, lovely time, made some great friends, and some of the most foolish occasions. But of course, this came with a negative. You know, this is the risk in medicine of 2 generations ago. And the toll was large. So, not just the drinking and the smoking. Of my 150 compatriots when I qualified for medical school, 2 committed suicide, and 1 walked in front of a car, and it was never suggested that it might be suicide, but those that knew him knew that it was. And that doesn't talk about the toll on the patients, which is perhaps, or it is more important. It was enormous. The adverse events, the things that we did that we didn't know that we were doing, was catastrophic. So how has medicine changed, and how has that risk been modified? Well, the most obvious place to start, of course, is hours. Not having fatigued people trying to do complicated things is an obvious place to start. When I returned to the United Kingdom, because I came out to Australia in 1992 after I finished my intern year, and returned 3 years later, the hours had modified enormously. So it had come down from those ridiculous 90, 100 hours. They'd introduced a European Working Time Directive, which limited work to 70 hours a week, which was good. In my interview, my consultants were asking me whether or not it would be a terrible thing to reduce the hours, because clearly we weren't going to be able to get the training done. And then it subsequently reduced to 40. But these are, these are guidelines, not mandated, so people obviously work a lot more than that. The next thing is the training. I mean, I look at medical students graduating and junior doctors and what they get now, and it's just unrecognisable. Medical schools do a fantastic job now. They prepare people really well. They give them good amounts of clinical time. They understand the expectations. It's not just basic sciences and jumping through hoops. And the training is ongoing. Once you qualify as a junior doctor, and I'm sure it's the same with nursing staff and with paramedics, you get protected training time. Sorry. Which group is that? Certainly for junior doctors then. And then the other things are what we as a profession collectively have done is to standardise care. So we've introduced guidelines and we've introduced protocols. Again, just harking back to the old days, work for one consultant one week, they want one thing, work for another consultant the next week, and it's completely different, and it's the same treatment condition that you're treating. So these have introduced great increases in how we deliver care. And they're evidence-based, right? There was nothing evidence-based back then, it was just opinion-based. I hate checklists. I totally hate checklists, but they are a necessary evil. And there is no doubt that they have improved care. I don't recommend anyone reads medical books. But on this occasion, I'm going to break that rule. This is a brilliant book called The Checklist Manifesto. Atul Gawande was a surgeon in New York, and when he wrote this book, he was in charge of surgical ICU in the United States. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there weren't intensivists back in the 90s, It was a medical ICU or a surgical ICU, and he ran the surgical ICU, and they had an awful problem with line-associated sepsis. It was over 30%. And he introduced a checklist to try and reduce this, and it was not rocket science. It was wash your hands, put on a pair of gloves, use a drape, use aseptic technique, and they weren't allowed to put in a line unless the nurse who was at the end of the bed with the checklist ticked off 5 things, and their line-associated sepsis plummeted by 20% in absolute numbers. The other thing that we've done is reviews. I mean, I've sat on patient safety committees and done RCAs and all these sorts of things, and there are always valuable learning lessons to be made out of that. They're really boring, but I mean, they're a useful part of it. Perhaps a little more interesting in the way that we've evolved, the way that we've practiced medicine, is in critical thinking. And this is something that's widespread. I'm sure you all know what critical thinking is. But for me, as an intern, we just, as a junior doctor back in the day, we just practiced on heuristics. That was all we did. What is critical thinking? Well, it was introduced by Daniel Kahneman well over 30 years ago now, and he won a Nobel Prize for that. He's a psychologist. And again, another good medical book review. It's a great book. It's super light and fluffy and really fascinating. And more recently, luminaries such as Pat Crosscarry have talked about in the emergency medicine field, type 1, type 2 thinking, fast heuristic thinking versus slow, deliberate thinking, making sure that we've gone through it using clinical decision rules. This, I think, has been a huge evolution in all forms of medicine and has reduced risk enormously. So, anyone sat on a committee or been a manager in an emergency department, they will be familiar with this horrendous chart. Every year, having done medical management, we would have to run through everything that we did and identify left-hand column, likelihood of something happening, and right-hand column, the consequences of them, and put those into that grid. I never want to see another one again. But again, a useful exercise, having a think about what we do. The only interesting thing about that grid is that it reminds me of my passion, and that's the other subject that I wanted to talk about. So the things that we do to make us, to define us in some ways, to get out from our work. And that's Alex Honnold. Everyone know Alex Honnold? He just recently climbed Type A 101. Didn't fall off. And that ledge there is known as Thank God Ledge because it's 500 metres up from the base, and most people have climbed, whatever that is, 16 pitches of climbing, and they get up there and it's the only flat bit on the way up. They've got another 350 metres to go, and unsurprisingly they say thank God. He didn't walk across from where the camera is, he climbed up there, and he's very happy just standing up there. Oh God, there it is again. But the point here is that climbing and risk matrix, they're exactly the same. What we do in rock climbing is that we go up something that looks stupid, but all of them have associated risks. The different types or modes of climbing are exactly that. How likely is it that something goes wrong? What are the consequences? How do we mitigate it? Oops, we've gone to... So in rock climbing, I'm not going to talk about speed climbing. That is an abomination and it should never have been allowed. So there's bouldering, there's sport climbing, which is with bolts. You can do 1 pitch or 2 pitches. So that's me on the 2nd pitch. Someone's belaying me up, I'm going up the 2nd pitch. If you fall off from the 2nd pitch and nothing works, it's bad. From the bottom pitch, not so bad. Trad climbing is a little bit more complicated, we'll come to it. And then there are people like Alex Honnold that do free soloing. So bouldering, can be indoor or outdoor. You don't fall far, you fall a lot, but the consequences are low. I always put a photo of each of my children in every one of my talks. That's number 1 son bouldering in Noosa. What's that like? That medically is like putting in a cannula. We do it all the time. Chances of something going wrong are low, but we do it a lot, and so eventually there will be a problem. People die of sepsis from an infected cannula site. Sport climbing is a little bit more risky. People put bolts into the rock. We clip the rope into those bolts, and then we climb up. You can only fall a certain amount below that bolt. This is a friend of mine called Sonny in the Blue Mountains, and he's going to demonstrate just how safe sport climbing is. What are you volume? This is a really hard climb.
Just thin.
That's all good, man. So it's safe. Look how much fun everyone's having. Maybe that's suturing a wound. There's a bit of higher risk of complications, but not a lot. Now, trad climbing is definitely a bit more risky. It's another friend of mine. You can see he's got a whole bunch of shit hanging off the back of his harness, and that gear goes into bits of cracks and rock and other features. You then clip a sling onto that, clip the rope up. So as you go up, you put the gear in, and if you're good at putting it in, it mostly holds when you fall on it, but not always. There's a skill associated with this, so the risk is higher. Pretty much all trad climbing is multi-pitch, so if you have a catastrophic failure, what's known as unzipping, then you can end up with serious injuries. And maybe that is something similar to a rapid sequence induction, something that I do infrequently. Doesn't make me scared, but it does make me think about what I'm going to do. And then there's free soloing. Here's Alex Honnold heading up in that movie, Free Solo. And basically the bottom line here is just don't fall. If you do, it's all toast. So how can we equate to this in medicine? Well, it might be something like letting an intern put in a transverse placement one. And in climbing, we do the same as in medicine. We do checklists. So we're religious about this most of the time. We create an acronym. There it is. And we go through an enormous number of checks before we set off that we've got a shared vision. We know that our equipment's all right. We know what the plan is going to be. We know what we're going to say, and the other person says back to you. We've got a shared communication system. There is closed-loop communication, and all of our gear is ready. It's just like a rapid sequence induction. So that's risk mitigation, how clever we are. What's the counter-narrative? What's the ugly bit about risk? Well, this is the bit that I think is the most interesting aspect. There's the zoom out, right? So we looked at the beginning with money. You lost 45%. But then look what happens. And this is history all over with financial markets. Stock indices go up 8 to 10% every year on average for over 100 years. So let's do a little comparison. If we knew the market was going to crash the next day and we put $1,000 just at the top in cash in 2007, by the time 2025, which is when I wrote the talk, came around, we'd have $1,780, which is not bad, but if you add in inflation, it's actually not very much at all. Now, if we had invested that $1,000 just before the crash, right, at the worst possible time, and then looked at how much money we'd end up with reinvested dividends, we'd end up with $3,200. So even though it was at the worst possible time in the last 25 years to invest in equities, we'd still come out ahead. I wish someone had told me that a long time ago. This is not financial advice. Let's talk about the good bits of risk in sports. I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit self-indulgent. But there is lots of published data that all of these improve by taking risk. Most importantly for me, it's fun.
Well, this is the approach to the mow mine. That's my mate Garn. Across the rocks. This is a swell, we've got to be careful. I hope it doesn't come up to the base. Oh, I made it!
I didn't stop laughing for another 3 minutes after that. What about our kids? Well, the data is exhaustive and unequivocal. It's brilliant. All the same indices on the last slide apply to risky play in children. The difference though, and this is the tricky bit as a parent, is what's a good risk and what's a bad risk. And that's really hard to tell, right? So as a parent, I really enjoyed this definition. They should look determined, but not terrified. And the data, as I said, is overwhelming. Of course, it doesn't always work out well. So I said that I've got 2 children. I always put a slide of both of them up. That's Miles. I don't know why he's in a toga, but there he is. He's off to school with his bust arm. And this is now a family story that gets replayed back to me whenever I say something that I want them to believe. If you think you can do it, you can do it. And of course, he didn't. So he ended up with a bust arm. The good news is that if you break an arm in childhood, your chance of dying as a child or an adult are reduced. Thank God for that. And it's probably because they learn, right? So we're going to quickly move on to the playgrounds again. So after all of those wonderful moves that they made in New York and in the United States, here's the product. We all recognise that. We've all sat there in the sun, looking at our iPhones as our children refuse to play on them because they're so boring. So the outcome of that study I alluded to in New York, it won't surprise anyone that there was a significant reduction in deaths from playgrounds. There was a significant reduction in broken limbs from playgrounds. There was a significant reduction in fun from playgrounds. And probably this is why, in play, there was an increased cause in traumatic childhood mortality. There was an increase in all-cause fractures in play. Ten years later, the 2 lead authors of that study suggested a return to high-risk playground. And it's not just in playgrounds. Who had a chopper? Yes! Oh, I so wanted one. Roaming distance in children from the 70s to today is reduced from 6.8 kilometres to under 2. Unsupervised play no longer exists. I was thrown out of the door and told to be back by dark. Nowadays, helicopter parenting, we all do it. The kids are driven to school, they're driven to their structured activities, and they're hothoused to academic success. This is the equivalent in medicine. So what is the ugly truth in medicine? If you allow people who are growing up in medicine to take risk, they have accelerated clinical skills development, their decision-making and critical thinking improves, their resilience improves, I'll return to that in a sec, and everything else that you want in your trainees increases. So resilience. Resilience is the opposite of depression, anxiety, and feelings of burnout. So I collated all the published studies in pre-hospital care emergency medicine doctors and emergency medicine nurses and asked, no, ChatGPT to do it all for me. And this is what they've produced. So the burnout is grey, the anxiety is green, and the depression is blue. And despite all of those things that we've done, it's just gone through the roof. There's a peak in 2021 and 2022, unsurprisingly, of COVID. And it looks like it's coming down, but if you exclude COVID, it probably is just still going up. Have we reduced skills by making sure that all our trainees are protected from doing something wrong? Have we reduced autonomy? Have we reduced their confidence? Have we improved patient outcomes, possibly in the short term, but what about the long term? And of course, certainly a lot less fun. So in summary, the avoidance of risk introduces unintended consequences. And I'd like you to think about risk reduction and unintended consequences in your day-to-day practice and potentially in your lives. I think, and I'm an old codger at the end, so I get to reflect, has the pendulum swung too far? I don't know. I'm certainly not advocating that 2 children should die from falling off something high so that other kids don't die. That's a pretty tricky one. One of the things that happened during COVID was the concept called the risk budget. And I think this is a fascinating concept that you should perhaps incorporate into your daily life, perhaps at work, but certainly in your sport. For me, that's something I do. I will go and do dangerous climbs that are higher risk, and then I will back off and do less dangerous climbs. You're all about to go skiing tomorrow or boarding, and I want you to take risk, but I also want you to consider it wisely. Thank you very much.